Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Marc-André Pigeon, or Marc-André Pigeon. I'm the director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives. And to those joining us here in person, as well as those who are joining us online for today's talk, welcome. Our speaker is obviously going to be Dr. Kirsten Wright. I'll introduce her in a minute. But before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. Kirsten's going to present for how long, Kirsten, roughly? About an hour. After the presentation, we're going to open things up for questions. For folks who are joining us in person, we're going to have some microphones. You can line up and ask your questions there. We may also walk around with mics if that's a preference. If you're online and want to ask a question, we're going to be adding a link and a passcode to the chat. And please click on that link, enter in the passcode, and submit your questions, and I'll read them on your behalf. Please note that this event, for those of you who are online especially, is recorded and then will be published on our YouTube channel in the coming days. Now it's important, we always like to do this, we want to acknowledge that we're coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory. This is the land of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Dene, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and it's also the traditional homeland of the Métis. And we're grateful for this opportunity to work on this land, share in its bounty, reflect on its beauty, and reaffirm our commitment to the hard, shared, and necessary work of reconciliation. Now, this notion of sharing, interconnection, is in some ways, I haven't actually heard Kirsten's talk, but I'm intuiting that this is an important part of Kirsten's talk. And it's also core to the signature area that's kind of sponsoring this talk today. And just in case it wasn't clear, this event that we're going to be enjoying here is being done under the auspices of the Communities and Sustainability Signature Area. And this is one of the Universities of Saskatchewan's kind of focal points. These signature areas are meant to define areas of research and scholarship and artistic work that embrace opportunities of history, place, investment, and kind of leverage the University of Saskatchewan's unique kind of place in the world. And our signature area, this Communities and Sustainability Signature area, has like this organizing principle. And it's this really simple idea that to kind of get real sustainability, climate sustainability, environmental sustainability, you need to have the support and work with and through community. And to get kind of resilient communities, you need to also kind of take seriously the kind of ecological context in which they exist. So that's the kind of generative idea, if you want to think of it that way, for our signature area. If this kind of big idea grabs you, I'd encourage you to reach out and get involved because we're organizing several Kirsten Wright talks this week. We have another one Thursday, and then here on campus, and then on Friday, we have another one in community at Station 20 West around Kirsten's work around housing and kind of modeling strategies and thinking about housing there. So if you are interested in following up on these talks, you can reach Natalie if you're in person, and Natalie is waving her hand. She's at the back of the room, and she'll get you signed up and involved. If you're online, you can ding Stan. You can reach out to Stan Yu, and he'll get you shared up and invited up to these events. Now, I want to introduce our speaker, but before I do, just a bit of context. In schools like the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, which is where this talk is being held today, we like to talk about how increasingly policymakers are facing these wicked problems. And wicked problems are really just these complex societal and economic challenges, maybe like the fentanyl crisis or climate change, or I might add the crumbling geopolitical order, that can only be solved in some ways by bringing people together and coming up with solutions that recognize and work with and not against these interconnections, right? So that's kind of how I think we need to think about these problems. Now, I don't know if you've been paying attention to recent events, but I'm going to venture a proposition, and that is that collectively we're not very good at solving these problems. We don't seem to be well equipped to do tackle these big, complicated challenges. And I want to offer a second proposition and I think part of the reason we're not so good at solving these problems is because we haven't really developed the conceptual tools or the language to kind of think about them in different ways. In fact, I'd say maybe we even had languages to think about these complex problems, but we've forgotten a lot of those languages. So that's all the kind of context for why we brought Kirsten here, because Kirsten is the managing director of the University of Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation. She thinks complex systems all day, every day, all the time, right? So this is her bread and butter. And Kirsten is also a poet. I learned just the other day from some friends of her. But she's a special kind of poet, not like the poet who writes verse, but she's the poet who speaks the poetry of system thinking. It's this kind of new language that I'm talking about that allows us to reformulate and re-engage in these really complex problems in a different way. And she comes by her poetry from this experiential kind of bedrock of being a robotics engineer, right? Like, how many social scientists have robotics engineers in their background? Hands up, right? Like, no one. She has a mathematical background. She studies complex and agent-based systems, right? That's why she's the managing director of the Center for, or the Institute for Innovation or Complexity and Innovation. She has, I feel like, and maybe it's just because I'm older, boundless energy. And she has a deep and real and engaged commitment to community, right? So it's this really beautiful, intersection of backgrounds that she brings. And she uses her poetry to bridge these divides. I think she used the word chasm. I've thrown it back at her a few times in the last couple of days. But to describe this space between kind of these, what we might call hard sciences of mathematics and computer science and engineering and artificial intelligence, topic of today's talk, to the place of application. How can we bring these ideas and make them real and put them into motion, which is kind of core to our signature area. And I first heard Kirsten speak her systems poetry about a little less than a year ago at a loud bar in Montreal. And I was a couple or two or three or maybe more drinks into the evening, and I still remember asking her to slow down, like she was talking to me really, really fast, or it seemed like she was. And I asked her, slow down, unpack, interpret. This poetry was really dense. It was hard for me to get my head around. But she was very kind and patient. And I can't say I came away fully sure that I understood what Kirsten was saying. But I did come away with the strong sense that I had just met someone whose intellect was really, like, frankly, luminescent, and whose system poetry, I think, demands attention and speaks to our moment that we're in. So Kirsten, I've been very lucky, has become a friend. She's been sharing her poetry with me for, it feels like every week or two or three since last August, right? Roughly, Kirsten, or July. I'm slowly absorbing some of the her poetry's meter, its figurative language, and I think we've started to map out some exciting projects that come out of this kind of almost poetic discourse around systems. And just to paint a picture, for me, it's a world of bright, bold colors, each of which owes their existence to the other, right? You can't have the colors without the other colors. And so today, this afternoon, Kirsten's going to share some of her system poetry with you in this talk on artificial superintelligence. And if you're all worried about your capacity to process this talk, and you might want to be a little bit, remember that you have the benefit of not having had one or two or three or four drinks. So you're ahead of where I was when I started in this journey. Or at least I assume you haven't had a few drinks before you came here. Hopefully not. But all the same, I want to encourage you to sit back and be patient with this new language, with this poetry of systems. Let it sit in, let it be. And then bravely, I think this is the part I think we're going to be called to action. Let it out in these imperfect words and unlikely conversations, because I think this is the only way forward. So with that, over to you, Kirsten. Welcome for Kirsten, please.
Thank you, Marc-Andre. So each age is defined in a real sense by a technology. We've had the steam engine, electricity, computation, and now artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is different because AI is increasingly coming to act like an agent. And artificial superintelligence, which we define as the threshold at which AI becomes better than humans at a significant share of the activities that humans engage in is a substantial shift in that artificial intelligence is no longer a good assistant. It deeply disrupts the assumptions on which our society rests. And even just tracing one of these threads of disruption through the system runs into almost everything else. And so in this talk, I'm just unpacking this thread of disruption to jobs. But in talking about the disruption to jobs, talking about illustrating a way of thinking about systems and the logic of systems and feedback and the approach that we sort of embed across the engagement with different disciplines at WICI, at the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation. So there's clearly some disruption to jobs, even with AI as it already exists, right? Whether it's 15 or 20% routine manual labor type jobs, or in some communities as much as 50%, that could be actually automated already with existing or near existing technology, right? But clumps of jobs, right? If all Uber drivers or if Amazon warehouses were to use robots to lift packages, there's a sort of abrupt something that's been growing, that's been a kind of fail-safe anchor of employment, suddenly disappears, right? So that it's not just the number, it's that there's chunks where suddenly something that was growing flips to a kind of a collapse dynamic. Then there's law, bookkeeping, accounting, parts of medicine, basically people acting like databases, right? What is the condition that you have? And with collective intelligence, when it's really realized, there's almost no way that a single mind is going to be anything like as good at that kind of pattern matching as a machine. Then art, right? Start to imagine paying an illustrator once these images can start to put text into it. So this is Ada, which is a robot, a physically built robot with paint. She sees with robotic eyes, and with these sort of metallic hands, creates paintings like this, right? So it crosses over with actuators into this valley of the uncanny kind of space, right? And this Ada is a piece of art in a sense. She does TED Talks, and they look very unrealistic, right? Because she's not actually the most advanced robot. But in photographs, it's this incredibly sort of, and she's actually using the artificial algorithm to speak about art, right? It's not that someone's written her text. It's not that someone has composed this painting. And it's not attached to this larger system. So in some sense, a joke, a comment, and also a kind of shift in what it is to do art and that kind of meta space. So my name's Kirsten Wright. I'm managing director with the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation. My background's originally in robotics and embedded systems. I did underwater robotics and then started to think about how I had tried to move into a field that let me do good through engineering. But it seemed like the dominant effect was the mobilization for military technology, right? And so that tension is what led me to go back into work in sculpture and architecture and building embedded systems there, and then ultimately back to the university working with Francis Wesley and trying to understand how systems work, and then build toy models to help people think about the logic of how systems can change and what can actually make a transformation. So in a sense, my whole career is defined by this transition. And what we do at the Waterloo Institute for Complex Systems is we take methods for understanding the common patterns ranging from cells to society and use them to think about how systems transform and the logic of transformation. So one of the things we look at is feedback loops, this kind of diagrams that make nonlinear dynamics and feedback loops accessible even for groups to engage with. And one feedback loop that ties into some of the assumptions in our society is that increased demand for something, scaling up production, increases the jobs, right? That if there's going to be a factory and somewhere somebody, if there's more demand, there'll be a job, and that'll be a big part of how the wealth and the value gets cycled back, right? It's this big value pump. And so if you have something that breaks that link fundamentally, then you have a disruption to the logic. And in the Waterloo tech space, there's this obsession with when will we get a billion-dollar unicorn, right? The fact that it's even imaginable that someone could build a billion-dollar company without hiring anybody, right? That's even a thought, a point of discussion, right? That is what people are trying for. People used to be trying for making an Amazon or a Google and hiring a bunch of tech workers, and now they're trying to do it on their own. And even if they fail, the disaggregation and the ability to be able to access almost any kind of skilled labor out of relation with actual people anywhere in the world at any time of the day, and to sort of discretize tasks into parts where you can hire this piece and hire this piece. It moves it into out of a relational context, out of a context where it's easy to organize, and into a logic of commodity, right? Which can have positive features in that it can drive the price down and make it easier to buy if you have money, but it can't do the distributional work. You can't put any distributional weight on that kind of a structure. And so then there's this second piece that comes with that same loop, which is if you're not creating jobs, if the demand doesn't create jobs, then the money's not pumped into the community, right? And so the ability to pass that signal, right? There's an idea behind, as an engineer, I can design a thing, and if it does good, there's a plausible link that I could believe in. I could make it help 1 million people, and that would be worth $1 million, which could be paying people to do things, right? That loop, which was never perfectly realized, and it was the carrier for all kinds of sort of predatory finance and problems and illusory. But as the logic goes away, the ability to even imagine it works goes away, right? And you see those who are trying to work through that mechanism, who are trying to, I love this metaphor you've used, this push on a rope, right? Trying to put any distributional weight onto that jobs feedback loop, they get more and more distracted by trying to serve a limited number of rich people who have the distribution, trying to basically close off value streams, trying to, rather than make anything anyone wants, claim a share of rent, right? Which arguably maybe that's part of what's happening in housing markets, right? The actual abundance, the making of all of these different kinds of value which are free, replicable without labor. I can watch however many movies and download and see beautiful things. That is a real abundance and a value that you would have paid for and you don't. And yet you can't eat, you can't house yourself. And we have assumptions that require growth and have only that jobs linked to do the distributional pump. And so the fact that these rent mechanisms, right, they're enclosing certain kinds, functionally enclosures as opposed to value creation, takes up more and more of the weight. It's coming out of the attempt to use the system, which is doing one thing, it's still making the value, but the money's not functioning in the same way. And we might say, okay, we'll just get a tax. You know, there's lots of other ways to do distribution. But there's a third dynamic here, which is the winner-take-all effects in networks, that being close to the eigenvalue centrality. If there's a bunch of places where if you have users in LinkedIn, it's very hard, you can't start a new LinkedIn. You're never going to get those kind of network effects, LinkedIn or Facebook, right? And so having the resources already in the network, already being connected, means that preferential attachment, that it's actually easier to get farther. And even in terms of cognitive development and capacity in kids, there are certain capacities that unlock the access to other capacities. But in terms of starting companies, this winner-take-all effect in networks is compounded by the spatial dynamics. So you see one of the universal sort of fundamental complex systems result is that wealth and productivity seems to scale superlinearly with density in cities, right? So the bigger cities, lots of things scale superlinear. Crime also scales superlinearly. Bigger cities have more crime, but they also have more production broadly measured. And whether that is using network centrality to claim a larger share of what's actually being sucked in from the periphery, or whether that's the network effects are actually driving some collision of ideas, and how that's disrupted by being able to work remotely, all of these are real questions. But in terms of just looking at where the concentration happens, this isn't a feature of modernity. It's not a feature of the computer age. It's not a feature of capitalism. It appears to go, those same scaling laws apply in hunter-gatherer communities and communities of 30 people. That the density, some of these values scale superlinearly. And so what does that mean in terms of a system that's no longer distributing through that baseline? Incomes don't actually distribute superlinearly. Capital ownership accumulates superlinearly. And so you've taken out that kind of balancing buffering effect, and you have just these unmitigated superlinear scaling effects, concentration, and that's sort of what's driving billionaires and trillionaires and that dynamic. So, well, the biggest cities are not in most countries, right? And so this is the Y Combinatorial startups. So this is a big accelerator in Silicon Valley that people go, a lot of people from Waterloo, from my university, go to launch their startup. And historically, right up until 2021, 2022, the number of those people who went to these international accelerators and started companies in Canada was rising, right? So there was a case, maybe not that most people were benefiting from these companies, but that the international markets were actually somehow connected with the Canadian market. And you can see big drop-off around the point that these AI startups take it, right? So there's some threshold where the reasons to start a company in Canada that people were, maybe it was just tax, maybe people were coming just for tax breaks, but those reasons have started to evaporate, right? And so if you have superlinear scaling of wealth and you want to imagine some alternative distributional mechanism, but only one or two countries actually even have the owners of companies in them, that's a different kind of policy. That's not just a qualitatively different kind of problem, right? The relation between people, that's a quantitatively different kind of logic and different kind of problem. So how do you preserve that sort of capacity, that basic logic of, if I'm going to imagine a thing and earnestly try and deliver it to people and have that be some mechanism of being able to fund doing work that serves people, right? That PUM. What are the options for keeping that thing functioning? And there's this isn't an abstract question, right? The level of inequality already in Canada is substantial, right? And it's substantially higher than people tend to think it is if you ask them. So these effects have been well underway for more than 30 years, and we're now seeing an acceleration of the trends. So that takes us to one of the methods we work with at the university, at the Institute for Complex Innovation, resilience. Right? One of the ways to manage is to try to create more jobs, but what is the resilience of economic flows? So resilience comes out of, there's a few different traditions of resilience. There's psychological resilience, which is a very different tradition. Engineering resilience, which is if you push a building, does it bounce back? What's the time? It's very precise. But the tradition that we work is called ecological resilience, which actually comes out of C.S. Holling's work at UBC, and who is a mentor to Francis Wesley, who was one of WICI's founders. And his observation was that there's a distinction between controlling to a certain level, how many trees are there in a forest, and the maintenance of an identity in a system. right? And the patterns for how that system's able to transform and maintain its identity before. The healthy functioning of a system actually contains variation, right? And very often the inclination when you're trying to solve a problem is to say, this thing is changing, I'm going to control that variable, right? I'm going to reduce the variability in something, or I'm going to push a measure up. But structurally, there are often all kinds of problems with introducing different kinds of rigidity when you try and suppress that flow, because systems do flow, right? A healthy forest, we did fire suppression in healthy forests, and they actually get more vulnerable to fire because dried wood builds up in the forest, right? And so the reducing forest fires, the efforts to reduce forest fires are the things that make the forest vulnerable to fire, right? And so that line of thinking, which you probably have heard of, right? Controlled burns and indigenous management and these traditional pieces, that comes out of this line of thinking about ecological resilience. And so there's patterns of cycling in any healthy system. There's also distinct regimes. So a system can cycle, it can burn, and the forest can grow back, and it can burn and grow back. And then there's distinct patterns of functioning. So one of the things you might see in Brazil with climate change, for instance, is what was forest that would burn and cycle back and come back to rainforest. It crossed the threshold where there's some hysteresis, some extra force you'd need to reverse, where it transitions to being a grassland, which is a distinct ecosystem with its own patterns. Or in a lake, a freshwater lake that's clear, that fish can swim around, has feedback loops that keep it relatively stable. But if it tips over and gets sufficiently covered with algae, then that creates a different setup. It supports different life, which then grows more algae, and there's a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop, where getting past that threshold means it's now spinning out of control. It's what you worry about with climate change, right? The white of icebergs reflects a bunch of light up. And so you've got a lot of leeway to sort of come back from emitting carbon dioxide until you cross a threshold. And then what was a white surface becomes a black surface, and the light it's being attracted. And so it may get to the point where it's not reversible, right? So protecting those buffers in the healthy functioning is one of the things to be thinking about in terms of how to build that resilience of a pattern of functioning. And at each of these stages, Holling talked about these three stages, that there's often, this is, thinking about life cycles of people. There's kids grow really fast. Young companies grow really fast. That's a normal part of functioning. But they don't always, there's no system in nature that is really linear forever. There's always some saturation point, right? And you might love babies and kids, but you don't make 80-year-olds keep growing at the same rate as babies and kids, right? There'd be bone problems, among other things. And then one of the things that lets novelty enter is that there's some release, right? So we were talking about immortality of ideas and the role of the academy in keeping Plato and Aristotle old ideas alive, that one of the characteristics of oral societies is that the old ideas release and the new stories enter, right? That old people die and new people come in, and we have technology that can open towards immortality, right? So there's something beautiful about not having to grapple with what's the worst thing we have to deal with, right? The end of life and losing beautiful art and stories and it being just in that moment. But at the level of the system, there's a fundamental tension. If you don't get rid of those who have power, those who hold the idea, you don't have there's not the same new space for new ideas to grow and enter, right? And one's not necessarily bad or the other, but in terms of evolving systems and in terms of being open to possibility and what the resilience literature talks about, which is the adaptive capacity, right? If you reset, if things are different, my rate of adoption of AI is less than my 9-year-olds, right? That is actually part of the way we can reset, And so there's a tension. And then the other piece is that there are characteristic traps in each of the points of growth and cycling, right? And so if you try to keep growth going on a long time, or without the before resources early stage and it's maybe easier to see in this one. In the growth stage, there's a poverty trap. If you just don't have resources and you can't get the growth, so this is often what startups struggle with, right? And why it's so important to think about investing in kids' nutrition is that characteristic trap of that deep, low resource, low connection stage is actually a poverty trap, right? Where there's a reinforcing feedback loop where if you can't get the resources to grow, you get stuck there. But at the conservation stage, the characteristic trap is rigidity, right? Often what we run into in bureaucracies or, very old institutional structures. That it's not, it might be easy to change in the poverty trap, but and that rigidity can prevent the flow of resources, right? The back loop can have a chaos trap. Like some people, there's a real possibility in it, but if you get stuck in the back loop, there's this kind of trap of chaos. And then at the reorganization stage, there can be a kind of lock-in trap. And these systems are also characterized by, they tend towards being fast and connected, but there's a kind of vulnerability with that speed and connection. So that connects into, I'm not going to go into it really here, but there's really interesting dynamics around the coupling of multiple systems and the decoupling, and how actually decoupling, which is one of the things that's possible with local economic activity and real relational work, is I was fortunate enough to live in a student co-op when the 2007 economic crisis happened, right? And for many, that resulted in foreclosures. And for us, because we didn't have a lot of debt, actually well capitalized, and we had a system of very local government, we were just able to sit down and have a conversation about, did we want to drop people's housing costs because they needed some help to get through and cut people's hours? Did we want to increase our staff's hour because they were likely to have a harder time? So there was a relational ability to adapt, and this asset was able to naturally serve a buffering role, right? How often do we try and push and get these buffering roles through macro policy at the same level the problem's coming in and it doesn't work too well? And it's just sitting there, right? Like very often, it's better to be able to have the resources to solve a problem at a different level than the level that's creating it. And having multiple scales and having some decoupling and even some slack can help with that. There was in the 90s this whole push around lean companies and cut everything, and you'll be efficient and you'll have high growth and you can regulate to that, you can get your top level numbers up. And Francis Wesley talked about this paper that traced the 10 most successful lean companies, and they all had failed 10 years later. They cut everything, even the capacity to adapt to the latest shock. So it looks really good in the moment, but it's a profound vulnerability at moments of change, right? And so artificial superintelligence means that we are at a moment of change, right? And so we need to structurally at every level be thinking not just about how we get jobs up, but how do we build in layers of buffering and resilience and decoupling so that we're not trying to use one system to control its variables in a way that actually breaks that logic. We're not stacking the firewood that will lead the whole thing to a massive burn. Where the burn can happen in one place, fine, that's part of what happens, right? There's change, there's disruption, people change jobs. You do not want to be replacing every single driver and every single Amazon worker and everything, accountant and artist. And name a career at the same time, globally, and then have a feedback loop to a globalized financial system without actually having the assets, right? We put a lot of energy into recapitalizing the banks. We haven't put the same effort into recapitalizing people, carrying credit card debt, to recapitalizing places, right? It's very visible when a bank crashes and you can't get paid, but the cascading effects of regions not having the capitalization to function, getting stuck in poverty traps, if you look at the outcomes for kids, it's just as profound and immediate an effect, right? And so articulating may not be as visible in sort of Davos meetings, but it is as viscerally felt in communities, right? Look at the opioid crises. So to sort of illustrate one of the other problems with controlling variables, right? We might be tempted to say, all right, this is, jobs demand. Let's fix that. Let's fix that up. So if jobs decline, let's make a little officer of job making. Let's get our kids in tutoring. Let's compete. Let's invest in their education. One of the things that when there's strain on jobs, there's measurable effects where people invest more right down to preschool for their kids. They experience physiological stress. They spend more to try and get jobs. And those are actually appear as jobs in the system, right? So some of the things where we expected maybe jobs would drop with previous layers of automation, some of it may just be that feedback loop of we actually were so dependent on jobs that they went away and we tried to make them back. So then it has no relation to value creation. It's actually a wasted energy to try and maintain a value that we're dependent on because we made a system that was dependent on distribution through this pump, pushing on this rope. So this is almost certainly happening. And, every city has the economic development officers, right? And they go out and they try and get companies to come there and not somewhere else. And I remember sitting on an airplane at one point and just having this visceral realization, just watching somebody load bags onto the truck to put on the airplane. And I was like, wow, that is actual work that needs to be done, right? We can't take off unless the bags get put in the airplane. And I was like, it has actually been weeks since I've seen someone doing something like that, right? People are very, very busy all of the time. But none of it actually causes anything to break if it stops. In that visceral, just the ease of, there's a thing that needs to be done, I can get up and do it. And yet most of human history was characterized by, 80-95% of energy was on getting enough food, right? On that viscerally basic essential work. Right, and it's only really the tip post-World War II, people who were in farming families came back and tipped into doing something else. That there's been all of this other, maybe it's other work, maybe it's other make work. David Graeber did a great anthropological study where he went around and asked people, do you believe your job is useful? And it turns out a huge number of people think it's not. Their job is not useful. And he says, well, maybe we trust people. Maybe they know more about what they're doing than others do, right? So it's an open question. One thing you could do is you could try and do that, but that's costly, right? And what about all of the other effects? But there's also a whole bunch of other things that you can do, right? And I think that's, in a sense, the work of the signature area and the center is how do you build local economies? How do you build relationships? How do you sort of anchor and buffer wealth in place and in relationship? And there's even a kind of transition to relational wealth, right? That my commodities might get cheaper, there's AliExpress and Amazon, and it might be $2 for a pair of pants. But still, when I'm biking downtown, there's just a kind of joy that comes from, this is the person that makes the cookie dough. And I could probably get it as a commodity somewhere else, but that's actually a different logic than a commodity logic, right? It's actually a relational economic logic, right? The intuitive sense that I have that a child has value is a value about it's a value that's created and destroyed. If my values change, there's actually value created and destroyed in that. There's this whole work that Paul Thagard does, who's at Waterloo and tied to some of the complex systems work, around cognitive affective model, arguing that whole cascading streams of value are flipped. Like when the societal values change, something that was good becomes a liability in people's minds, right? Whether that's a style change, a color, or even a shift in values about environment or health. Carl Winequist. The other piece of this is that we have a kind of arbitrary, in many societies, the ability to sleep somewhere and to eat food, that wasn't controlled by anyone outside yourself, right? You could hunt or pick berries. The ground was not particularly well policed. You could sleep anywhere. There's some people in some places, and you're born into community, right? Like you're born into a set of rights and relationships. And so there's a very unusual shift in saying the income starts at zero, right? And if you do not do work, you have not earned your living. You don't get to live, right? That's a particular choice in an age of as much excess and abundance and productive capacity as we have, right? We totally take it for granted. It's like the ground that you stand in, like earn your living, natural phrase to say. But it's weird, right? And it has this property from a math side in that it contains a zero crossing. And just to go on the metaphor side, anytime you have a zero crossing, you can get divide by zero errors, you get all kinds of mess. You add a zero crossing into your math. And interestingly, and only making the claim of analogy here, we get those with that feedback loop because we will not morally tolerate what it actually means for somebody who's failed to make a living because they have a disability or because they've chosen not to or because they're tied up with addiction. Some people might tolerate for them, but for their kids, we won't tolerate that, right? And so that kind of moral necessity to say, look, let's find 10 ways of fixing it, right? And it turns out, and what this book does a brilliant argument of, is it is really expensive to put Band-Aids over that. It's vastly more expensive than shifting that line up, right? And like on the order of 10 times as expensive. So what is driving that, right? Like why would we spend 10 times as much to do something punitive and try and put Band-Aids on it? Because we both insist on doing that because of our gut sense of morality, running it through zero, you cannot live without it, and then pay 10 times as much to sort of not fix the problem but pretend you are. Like it's bizarre when you just look at it like that. And it has a kind of, it has to do with our sense of how do you get people to work, the whole system of mobilizing labor to do boring things, to serve themselves through that original supply and demand loop, right? The number of acrobatics that we had to do to get that loop sort of, because we put too much weight on it, in part, right? So we put so much weight on that loop that we're gonna make it work even if it does a kind of brutalization to our souls and our spirits, and it means we have to walk by people in the street and we have to watch them die. And like, coming from a center where we look at common patterns across cells to society and ant colonies is also absurd because nobody does this. The ants are a great example because ants also have large organized societies, right? And so we can look at small ant colonies and big ant colonies and all the sizes of ant colonies because there's so many ants and you can count them. And when they get into a larger, more organized society, what do you think they do? It's more efficient. They rest. Stop working. There's more people that are not active. There's more ants that are not busy, right? And so we're insisting on doing harm to people to maintain a myth that has to do with maybe an ethical or a scarcity or fear or an organizing principle, and not acknowledging that just there is a pattern. You get good at things, you don't have to be so busy, and you don't need to create, right? This is what happens when we govern for those top-line things. You create those feedback loops, right? And you sort of get into these knots, but there's sometimes a simpler way. So we can do a whole other talk on fiscal policy. We've been talking a lot about public banks and the way in which you back value, and there's lots of things to do. And I made this slide with AI. You just gave it a list and it can put it into a picture. So why would I hire a graphic designer or make a thing? But it gets at who works, who owns, and a fundamental shift in labor and capital. But maybe it's also opening and making clear something, like maybe it's the disruption that lets us get to something we should have maybe got to a while ago. Right? In terms of the logic of how you make something that just does the basic work of if you're making a whole bunch of good things with the intention of serving people, that there's some path that it can get to those people. So thriving together, an AI-powered slide where everyone belongs. I wanted to make this a yellow brick road, but I didn't have time to ask it again. But this is one thread, right? This tracing this disruption through jobs. But there's so many places that artificial superintelligence and that threshold where it's like our identities are constructed around the things that we do, right? And the value and the creation, and from the values to the social system, the biological system, to physically, what does this mean with killer robots and with relational robots that listen and do childcare and pick from tall canopies? And does that mean we could do regenerative farming? Like, all of these questions also are tied up with the same thing. And there's this huge vulnerability in this kind of centralized development of AI, right? And thinking through those assumptions. And that there's a real need to actually engage from a design as well as from a critical perspective, right? That the world is, whether it was made and imagined before, the world is made and imagined now. And there's a responsibility to engage across all the levels with that. And there are these patterns and tools for thinking in systems about it, right? About the resilience, about the feedback loops, about the incentives and the patterns, and what happens in an ant colony. And, you know, if the singularity is a mirror, it's also reflecting our values, right? About who is deserving, what we'll tolerate. And it has these logic of the patterns and system, right? So we can't choose. It's not just the psychology, and it's not just the common patterns, the things that we can measure, but it's relating these and holding this relationship between the parts and the whole. And there is certainly, I think, an urgent need for that kind of relational grounding, building a value in place that stays in place and in relation and in community. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kirsten. We're going to go to questions now. Stan, you have the laptop is there for me, but we can take some questions here if anyone wants to step up. Jan, you always have a question.
Kirsten, that was really inspiring, and you just connect. Clearly, you are a systems thinker. You connected so many different ideas. I don't even know where to start. I think I have two questions. On the universal basic income, one of my questions is that it always seems to be set up as this either, you know, we give people money or we force them to work or they starve, but there is a way of merging the two ideas, that people think that work is valuable and that people should be encouraged to work or contribute to society, with the idea of a guaranteed idea. And so I'm just wondering, do you see it as a way that you can actually merge this moral feeling people have about work, but also support people? So that's question one. And question two is, I think, a broader question around the premise of the whole argument, which is that this is fundamentally different, that labor and capital are fundamentally different. And I might just ask that inequality used to be much larger, you know, way back, and that we've seen these cycles. And so what really does make this current moment in time different than all of the, over time, sort of who owned the factors and means of production versus who didn't? What is it that's fundamentally different this time than all of the other times throughout history? So those are my two questions.
Yeah, such beautiful questions. Yeah, absolutely. So the first question first, basic income guarantee, ideas about motivation, and that there's a need to contribute, and that viscerally felt sense of deserving and paying into something. I mean, and then the sort of philosophical sets of questions about ability to promise, right? We were talking about Christina Biffieri's work on cascading norm collapses, that people's ideas about things and the ability to pack different kinds of cultural information is actually really disrupted, sometimes by advertisers and sometimes by expectations. And so there's, I think, a whole set of conversations that would be really interesting to unpack around the ability to promise. In terms specifically of basic income, there are very few, I think, grounding in collaborations with anthropologists and kind of Elinor Ostrom's approach could be really useful, as well as the huge number of experiments that have been done. But there are relatively few cultures where people are just born in to all of their rights and responsibilities. In many, many cases, there's actually a journey arc, right? There's actually a process of leaving, a process of going through, a process of really going into yourself And it's by going through that you become a part of the society. And by becoming a part of the society, that's how you get becomes a more resilient claim on the fruits of the labor. And, different societies are navigating scarcity in different scarcity and constrained contexts. But in a sense, that's actually what we do with tenure in universities, right? And that you make a set of processes, they're really hard, you jump through the hoops, but you earn something that's stable through that, right? And it's different by field, and it's different in lots of ways. But it's revealing, I think, that we don't have that in the trades or in the arts, that tenure, that anything where it's not even that there is a standard or a requirement or a retreat or a process of depth informing the self. It's actually remarkable, the standardization, right? Like grounding that much more in the particular culture that you join in the community, which is why a lot of the sort of indigenous work around community and self-governance is really, really interesting in that sense, that it may be that the norms actually aren't centrally controlled, but that there's, like algorithmically, we could look at what is the ability to promise, what are the distributional properties, and try different approaches. But the model of tenure, right? The model of how do you actually unlock? And then the other thing is plan. Al Admansky is part of this, with many, many others, this work on how do you support kids with disability, right? And one of the things that they did is the Registered Disability Savings Plan, where the community is actually able to count in a disability. So it's not just the individual can save, but the community is actually able to build diversified assets at every scale, right? You can capitalize organizations, you can capitalize, and they can be responsive, right? So there are cases where having money in yourself, if you're trapped in a cycle of addiction, that can do harm, right? But there's different kinds of social supports, or there's a relationship to it. So I feel like the diversity matters in structurally, and having one class of assets is more likely to be more vulnerable, even structurally. And then there's a set of philosophical questions, and then there's community. And maybe it's possible to actually allow more difference because you have a better understanding of the dynamics of the system level. So not an answer, but some things to think about. What is different? So yes, inequality is not the thing that's different. That's a power law that goes all the way back. But that the inequality in an industrial age and in an agricultural period was very dependent on labor, right? That they actually did care about doing a lot of work on social control because they needed a lot of labor, right? And arguably certain more nomadic communities had much less of that, but not needing labor is a really, really different logic, right? And so it's not an inequality piece, the speed and connection, the size of the system, that's what's scaling the inequality. But the ability to organize a general strike is harder. So the kind of levers that would work, you might imagine, what is organizing in place and in community and in networks? What is the deep transformation? What are the kind of alliances, right? And the ability to use ideas as tunneling mechanisms is a quantum analogy, right? That the strategies are different. I think fundamentally different. And I think recognizing with that there's a shift that from an analysis perspective, the labor theory of value is very useful. And it actually doesn't do the same thing in certain scenarios going forward, or may not, right? And so what does that mean?
Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Dion. Any more questions online? I'm going to invite folks to submit a question online. I'm monitoring the screen, but while we're waiting for questions online, are there any more questions in the audience here? Yeah, John, go ahead. John, I'll get you to go up a mic if you don't mind, please.
Thank you for the awesome presentation. Sarah Wynne Williams, in her book, Careless People, about her time at Facebook, towards the end, had an interesting comment that AI will be the policy battlefield between technology and government. Mm-hmm. And she made that as a thought-provoking statement to get people to think of. She doesn't answer the question, it's more What does this comment mean to you? I'd be really interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, I don't know what she means by it. What was the context for?
I think from the tone of her book. Do you want me to put that?
Sorry, John, if you don't mind,
Let's
please.
chat.
Just for people online, thank you.
I think from the tone of her book, when she looked at some of the things that happened with interference in election, it was a failure of government to step in and regulate. But government moves at a certain pace and technology moves at a different pace. And so where government, it's that rigidity trap probably, that how, and with all due respect to lawyers after having spent a long time in the Ministry of Justice, lawyers like precedent. So what does the past tell us about how to deal with today, where technology is more of the art of the possible? Where are we going? And that will work things out. So I think that might have been part of what she was looking at, is that dynamic tension between those two traps, to take it back to one of your excellent slides.
There's certainly been a shift, right? There was a movement under Biden to start to do a different kind of regulation. And there's been a real political shift in the US and perhaps emerging in Canada in the tech community that is sort of step back from that, right? Competition at all costs, as much energy as possible, chop and dig. Part of that is that the frontier now is much more like what it was in a colonial context, where it's resource constrained, right? We have a physical resource constraint on scaling up servers, where that was not the case for a period of time, right? So the demands that industry was putting on the state have shifted in what their kind is. So there's the culture, the move fast and break things culture, the tolerance for breaking things. At what point is too much broken? And then if there is the disruption of labor, we've started to see these sort of 10%, 15% cuts as well. I think maybe some sign that some of it's anticipatory of AI labor supply, and that some of it's also strategically actually responding to a belief that wages got too high over COVID, and attempt to pull them back, sort of going back to a 1990s playbook. So that's certainly a point of disagreement, because government's quite keen to see labor costs from firms. But certainly the tensions weren't there, and they are in a different kind of way now. I mean, there were always fault lines. Everything's for the point of exaggeration, the purposes of exaggeration.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Any more questions here? I'm still waiting for questions from online. Please send them to the stand. Yes, go ahead, Murray.
Thanks, Kirsten. That was excellent. You describe in your hauling cycle that the release reorganization phase, and you talk about the need to remove some of the people that are in power from that, and I think what you're getting at is, or let me see if this is right, the nature or the way that process works. What dies off, what is removed in that process determines how that cycle is going to go through the next time. I think we can see today that we're going through one of those cycles where we're trying to release and reorganize. I mean, that's a kind way perhaps of painting what's going on in the US at the current time. But there's nothing that's in that system that says that that's going to give us the kind of outcomes that we want. And each of these systems will move according to a particular dynamic. Do you have is there anything else you can say about that process other than what I've sketched out? I'm looking for some additional way of understanding where we are at the current time. So if you can provide some thoughts on that, that would be great. Thanks.
So one of the things that can happen in complex adaptive systems is resources can be released and you can cycle into a new cycle. Another is death or extinction, right? When you draw those basins, one of the things that people draw with those different basins of attraction, you might cycle in a functioning ecosystem or conditions in which humans survive, or in which there's this many people, or there's an agricultural system, or there's a nation state system, or whatever. One of the things that you can accelerate the transition into is actually another state, a collapse state, right? And that's what the worry is. Another is that you could transition into a kind of local resilience, a different dynamic of a logic where this system's not quite so fast or coupled. To go back to David Graeber, he says, all revolutions historically were about debt and land ownership, right? Cancel the debts, tear out the land tenure, right? And so there's been a real suppression of that as an instinct, where it's not, most marches are not about that. But historically, without such a sort of well-informed and carefully educated group of demonstrators, they probably would have been. And that's a release again, right? So that top, and again, none of this is normative, right? It's not saying like it's good to have the introduction of new possibility or whatever. It's just saying without the release of the resources from where it's bound tightly, they're not released. Right? They're stuck in a formation and they don't come into a new formation. Right? And so there was the Cambrian explosion of all of the niches of life had not been filled and there's new species evolving all over the place. Well, is that better, or is continuity of existing species and better? Right? That the explosion of life is because of all of the things that didn't have life in them. Right? And it's these follow extinction events. So there's the release. And maybe that's what they're working on in the US government. Maybe it's a release of resources for possibly redistributive purposes. It also could be an attempt to hold on to a kind of rigidity, right? To hold on to a certain position, a particular kind of ego status. But the sort of debt and entitlement and those kinds of structures, like functionally that debt jubilees, there's feedbacks in the debt system that are one of the things that I had a few weeks where one of my existential crises was there's some really weird feedbacks here. This is a mess. And then I said, I never need to worry about it again. Ecological systems, those feedback loops, you have extinction, you can't come back. These are actually numbers that are written on paper. Right, like it does do murder, right? It's not a morally neutral thing, but there are promises between people that have been canceled at all kinds of points in the history, right? And so it's not real in the sense of erosion of cutting down a forest. And so there's human life, and there's economic systems, and there's how they're coupled. And there's what the pattern of functioning is, right? And it's on multiple levels. Like a family can switch to a different state, but still be in the same economic system. One that's abusive, one that's regenerative, one where it's split into different people who've gone in different paths. It's just a rich set of metaphors to play with.
Okay, well, there's a question here. Before you do, I have a quick little hot pursuit. No, get up. I'm just going to say I get on radio fairly frequently to talk about fiscal policy, and people are obsessed with deficits, and I always kind of remind them that these are accounting entries. These are systems that record who owes what to who. They're not as fundamental or structural in any way like our climate, like our ecological systems. And we can change these systems, right? We can't necessarily change these. We have big collective action problems. Anyway, just want to lean in on that. Go ahead, your question.
Thank you. And before I ask my question, I just want to say I will need to listen to this a number of times. I am not an economist, so I was like, anyway, there's a lot. It was very good. So my question is actually about your very last slide, and I think it's sort of the singularity is looking in the mirror, and we want it to be something we're proud of. And I was just curious if you could, maybe not, okay, that slide. And You had also earlier said about the AI companies being like really focused in the United States and really just a few companies. And I was just wondering how we're supposed to be proud of the reflection in the mirror of the singularity if it's being determined by these few tech companies, and what your thoughts are about that.
Well, first of all, ChatGPT was kind enough to make this slide for me. It's very optimistic as an algorithm. So point well taken. We as a person, a cell, a whole conglomerate of things, a constellation of planets. There's sort of different scales to the we. This room may not have total control over that. At the same time, we've started some work with Vanessa Andreotti, who does this work on gesturing towards decolonial futures and relational technology, and wrote a book called Hospicing Modernity, which is just beautiful about the actual layers of work, that it's not just a matter of shifting to a new system. There's ways in which you're attached to it, right? And like there's emotional work processing and composting and hospicing and just sitting with a system as it transitions. And there's grieving in that. And one of the things that's really interesting is there's actually been a lot of work. Vanessa's team has started engaging with artificial intelligence as a very generative force, working with Indigenous communities and communities of practice and in education, saying, well, how do you make relational and life-affirming approaches to artificial intelligence, right? How can there be tools? Like, how can you trust, how do you trust the servers? How do you secure the servers? How do you divide into pieces and govern the governance of the physical infrastructure and the democratic exercise and the choice that makes possible in terms of developing human capacity? And then the ability to say, I'm not sharing this data set. This is incredible work. And Canada's done a lot in this area around data sovereignty and the governance of it, and that there becomes all of these ways to share where you don't share the base data set, but you're able to share the insights, right? And that resilience, fast connected systems may be very coupled, but you can build in structural decoupling. There's also all kinds of work on how you can have an identity that can make promises, but it's not revealing of your personal traits, so you can get tracked through it. How you can do different kinds of purchases and make different kinds of promises with on-chain kind of purchasing, right? That taking, okay, well, who designs what for who, right? If we can understand and trace the value in these very rich and sophisticated and beautiful interfaces, well, what is being traced by whom, right? And the potential for that kind of value creation in the startup phase and the social exit and the supporting, like if there's a public investment, how do you trace the public investment, which is an actual public asset, right? Currently we give it all away, right? And so how do you decide together, right? The potential for actually building an actual relational infrastructure. Just like we can't put anything on that rope of jobs will do it all. We can't put anything on that rope of go in your room and write an essay anymore. So maybe that will bring us out of our rooms and we'll sit together and chat. It's going to be your course next term.
Thank you for that question. I have some questions, but before I have a small announcement for my son. Your mom's coming to get you, so you need to go and meet Mama at the entrance. Sorry. Okay, Kirsten. One of the books for me that was really important and kind of putting me on this complexity path was this Unaccountability Machine by Dan Davies, Dan Davies, the British author, and he talks about this moment where there was a real energy behind kind of systems thinking, cybernetics, and it's completely dissipated, at least from the social sciences perspective. You just don't see a lot of it. You come from an engineering tradition, and it's kind of almost second nature.
It's disappeared from my program.
Yeah, and it's disappeared. So, and it is hard stuff to kind of get your head around, right? And so, how do you think about your role in this space and putting these ideas out there and helping people see, because it is I find it a really powerful analytic tool, but it's not something you can absorb in one lecture, and it's so how do you think about that challenge? Because you're in this all the time.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I came through systems design engineering. And one of the projects a few collaborators and I have is actually tracing and finding the old textbooks that were, people's courses that they developed, treating all of these different approaches to systems and cybernetics and patterns. And those courses aren't in the curriculum anymore. Those people have left and they've been kind of lost. So it's absolutely missing even in disciplines that it's still in the title.
Right.
But they sort of it's a project like the project of writing essays, right? It wasn't always that everyone got some rigorous training in that kind of ordering of ideas, which expands into a different kind of thinking. And in one sense, there's these gateway tools like system mapping, right? Which it has a very parallel structure. It's like you're writing an outline, but you do more circles. And so you connect these patterns and you can frame it as many questions, right? It's one picture that actually gives a picture of your questions as opposed to freezing the logic of your answers. And to me, these are actually complementary logics that are part of the apparatus of thinking, and they matter more the more we're at moments of transition and we have to make actual decisions, right? It's not enough to know. You actually need to look 2-3 effects out, right? You can't make an argument that sounds good. You have to go, what is the unintended consequence? Because that is the opposition, that your action is going to mobilize opposition, right? And without an understanding of the pattern and the history, but also guesses about what that opposition will be, what is the countervailing, who's hurt by it, you can't function in this kind of system. So I think it's part of it. There is actually a reframing of the tools of how we think, and computers make so much more possible, right? Thinking with toy models, thinking with these simulation games, which kids are growing up immersed in the logic of physics games, but we haven't translated that into a rebuilding of the academy, and specifically a rebuilding of the academy that focuses on intrinsic value, right? And that holding of the tension between forming your self-making, broadly speaking, and engaging in the world with actual people. I think it's actually, as a facilitation question, is how do you better hold the tensions? Like very often when we're doing something right, is that it's not that we have the wrong idea, all the ideas are there, it's that the facilitation, the structure holding it, doesn't hold the tension well enough. And so it becomes a division as opposed to a generative battery or a dynamic. And so that's an opinion coming out of lots of work on process design, but would be a lot of other conversations to talk about.
Murray has a question, but just an observation is like, so I love this. Of course, then I think, well, Donald Trump doesn't think 3 steps ahead, or some people say he plays 3-dimensional chess. But I think he's just saying things, and it's kind of A/B testing. It worked, I'll say more of that. It didn't work, I'll do less of that. And it's just, it's like, it seems like this complexity is almost self-defeating because it slows you down in a way, right? Anyway, that's just
the logic of power is in tension with it at times.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
But the unintended consequences of that, for instance, the debanking of the U.S. to go to
yeah. Go ahead, Murray.
Actually,
de-dollarization.
I want to follow up on the point that Marc-Andre was just making. As you probably know, there's a book that's getting quite a bit of press these days by Klein and Thompson called Abundance, and their argument, and it's more complicated than this, but at one level it is that the processes that we've designed have become too bureaucratic, and we're trying to take account of too many things. For partly because of Marc-Andre, partly because I had played around with this years and years ago, I've been reading a fair bit of the systems stuff lately. And I worry at times that is going to further draw us into even more bureaucracy and less able to actually deal with these, I think, contradictions that have developed within our systems. And I think are going to make us even less able to actually break out of and do that regeneration and release that is actually needed. And so Can you give me any hope that that is not the way that we're going to end up using this?
I am. I don't know if I can give you hope. I can express that I have hope. That counts. So yeah, there's. I mean, I'm very grounded in a university that is an engineering first university, and so it's deeply engaged in action even before thought. And one of the things that we do a lot of work with is processes around social innovation labs, right? And convening. I don't know if you've seen the Oxford Map the System competition, but yesterday was the finals for our school, which is just engaging kids in building these maps, but they're actually building them with partners, right? They're interviewing people, they're creating an object that's of use for practitioners, they're understanding and assembling their network. It's a thinking exercise like an essay, except that they know 10 people and they've learned to be of use to them, and they've learned to listen, right? And they've learned to make these different kinds of pictures, and then they actually translate. One of the tools that we use within that is this whole body of work around developing theories of change, right? So a picture that is articulating the logic by which an action would have an effect, right? And the lab process, which is sort of convening that writ large, convening those who could change a system in a deliberate way around a shared understanding with the energy of the convening and the evidence that you can assemble. Similar, like these are work, it's hard to fund the thing that comes out of them unless they're funded by a funder and there's money attached. But they consistently find a set of investable, if you have any path on the sort of multi-scale impact things, and a common, so they find a set of interventions that are very likely. They often get the prototypes spun up. They get people across sectors working together in a really structured and deeply connected and high trust way. And one of the best resources that we have in Canada is the 20 years of unusual, like there's also really strong work in New Zealand and UK, but this network across, sort of high trust network across sectors, I think is an incredible resource to connect into the work that's happening here and in the co-op and all of these different movement pieces. Because there's a kind of energy that's pre-identity formation, right? It works on multiple levels, and it's saying, okay, just, what are the processes to do what? Which is, if reading and thinking is part of it, but it's not the end point. Marie
has a follow-up. And then I have an online question. Yay. Go ahead.
We'll just take a second. That's actually very hopeful. I think one of the things for us to think about is, if we go back to the 1970s, 1980s, I think people at that point in time had wonderful ideas about what environmental impact studies and cost-benefit analysis would be able to do to also scope out projects and so forth. And I think those were turned into tools that actually slowed down, rather, in many instances, slowed down activity rather than actually meeting the needs of what they were ultimately and originally designed for. And so I think what we have to do is keep in mind the way that this could go to speed things up and really hold the processes to that, because otherwise, if history is any guide, we'll end up they'll get captured by a different group for entirely different purposes.
Thanks, Marie. So the question from online is, we like resilience in individuals, buildings, ecosystem, but resilience often falls short when applied to communities, social systems where structural inequities, inequalities are systemic and systematic. I think it's a statement, but do you have a reaction?
Yeah, I mean, resilience can be very bad, right? Slavery is a resilient system. Right? The resilience of the residential school system is not something we celebrate. The resilience that holds patterns of abuse in place in families. The resilience that holds sort of systems of debt that trap people in poverty. People are born into poverty through them. There's all kinds of resilience. Resilience is just the holding, right? The pattern persisting, right? It's a description of pattern, and it's always a choice, a value choice to how we think about what kind of resilience in what context for what, right? It's a systems design. It's a property of a system, right? So if you know that you're trying to achieve something and you're going to do it by controlling one top level variable, you're going to have unintended consequences, right? So it doesn't achieve your goal. So that's a problem, right? So managing to maximize GDP and some of the really fast connected systems that are actually creating the vulnerabilities, that's a problem given the goal. It's, if you're trying to sort of mitigate when you have the zero crossing, you're trying to do a thing in one part. And so it's a really important point, right? Very often people say resilience and they mean goodness and love and puppies, and that's not what it is.
Any last questions here before we wrap up? I don't have any more online. All right. Well, listen, thank you so much, Kirsten. That was a really thought-provoking talk, and we're really grateful. And we'll stick around for a few minutes. So that brings to close our talk, and I hope everyone has a good afternoon and evening. And Natalie, what do you want to say? There's mugs for free at the exit of the room for those of you in person. All right. Have a good evening, everyone.